A tiny, helpless puppy was trapped in a storm drain. His cries drowned by the relentless rain. People passed by too busy to notice, until a homeless boy stopped, his heart aching for the little creature. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't reach him. The water was rising fast. Then out of the shadows a mysterious man appeared. Someone no one expected to be a hero. What happened next left an entire community in tears. Chapter 1. Cries in the Rain. The rain had been relentless since dawn, pounding the streets of Chicago with icy sheets that blurred the city lights. Thunder rumbled overhead, shaking the air, while rivers of water rushed along the curbs, feeding into the storm drains that lined the cracked sidewalks among the deafening noise of the storm. There was a softer sound, one barely noticeable amidst the downpour, a tiny, desperate whimper. The source of that sound was a small puppy no more than 6 weeks old, its fragile body half submerged in a storm drain. It had short, matted fur, the color of caramel, though the rain had darkened it to a deep chestnut. Its eyes, wide, glassy and terrified, blinked rapidly as water swirled around its tiny paws. The puppy had no collar, no signs of ever belonging to someone, and yet it cried as if pleading for a rescue that seemed impossible. Pedestrians hurried past with umbrellas and raincoats, their faces turned downward, oblivious to the tiny creature's struggle. The streets of Chicago had a rhythm of indifference where rushing through was easier than stopping. No one noticed except for Ethan. Ethan was 11 years old, but the harshness of life had aged him in ways no child should endure. He was thin, his frame wrapped in layers of oversized, ragged clothing that barely kept him warm. His dark brown hair was tangled, his face smudged with dirt, and his sneakers, once white, were now soaked and torn. He had been living on the streets for months, ever since his mother had disappeared, leaving him with nothing but the worn-out backpack slung over his shoulder. Most people ignored Ethan, just like they ignored the puppy. He had learned long ago that begging for help only led to cruel stares and murmured judgments. But when he heard the tiny whimper, something in him refused to walk away, kneeling by the grate. Ethan peered inside his heart, twisting at the sight of the shivering puppy. "Hey, little guy, hold on," he murmured, stretching his arm through the bars. But the opening was too narrow, and the puppy flinched, scrambling against the rising water. Panic surged through Ethan's chest. The rain wasn't letting up, and the water level inside the drain was rising fast. If no one helped, the puppy would drown. He looked around, searching for someone, anyone who might listen. "Please, someone help!" he shouted, waving his arms at the passing figures. Beneath their umbrellas of a businessman in a sleek black coat barely spared him a glance. A woman in heels pulled her child closer, avoiding. His gaze, a teenager with headphones, walked right past. No one stopped. Ethan clenched his fists, his breath quickening. He was used to being ignored. He had spent too many nights curled up in alleyways, too many days watching people pretend he wasn't there. But this wasn't about him. This was about the tiny life in that drain, a life that was slipping away. With every second, he turned back to the grate, ignoring the rain soaking. Through his clothes, he had to do something. That was when a deep, weathered voice spoke behind him. "What's going on, kid?" Ethan spun around and found himself face to face with Frank. Frank was a man in his late 50s, his once broad shoulders now slumped from years of hardship. His salt and pepper beard was unkempt, his skin rough and tan from years of exposure to the elements he wore. A tattered brown coat over an old flannel shirt, his boots caked with mud. But despite his worn-out appearance, his blue-grey eyes were sharp, observant. Frank had been homeless for over a decade, moving from shelter to shelter, never staying in one place too long. He spoke little about his past, but there was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself. He had learned how to survive when the world had forgotten him, and yet, unlike most, he had not lost his ability to care. "It's a puppy," Ethan said quickly, pointing to the drain he's stuck, and the water's getting higher. Frank crouched beside him, peering into the darkness below. The puppy whimpered again, barely keeping its head above the water. Frank exhaled sharply. "Damn storm," he muttered. "All right, kid, we gotta act fast." He pulled a metal hanger from the bag slung over his shoulder, a makeshift tool he often used to fish through dumpsters for scraps. He bent it into a hook, sliding it through the bars, trying to loop it under the puppy's small body. But every time he got close, the water pushed the puppy further. "Out of reach!" "Come on, little guy," Frank murmured, his voice steady. "Work with me." Ethan held his breath, his fingers gripping the cold metal bars as Frank tried again. The rain pounded harder, the water inside the drain churning wildly. The puppy yelped, then suddenly slipped its tiny body, plunging deeper into the rushing water. "No," Ethan screamed, his heart stopping. Frank cursed under his breath. The rain wasn't slowing down. The drain would flood within minutes. Ethan felt helpless, his chest tight with frustration. The same helplessness he had felt when his mother had left, the same helplessness that had followed him every day since, but this time he refused to let it win. He looked up desperately at Frank, but the old man was already making a decision Ethan never expected. With one swift motion, Frank tossed his coat aside and moved toward the edge of the drain. His hands gripped the wet pavement as he positioned himself, preparing to do something. "Reckless, what are you doing?" Ethan gasped. Frank shot him a wry, tired smile. "Somebody's got to go in." And with that, he lowered himself into the rushing water. Frank barely had time to register the icy shock of the water before it pulled him under. The current was far stronger than he expected, a churning force that slammed him against the slimy concrete walls of the storm drain. Darkness swallowed him, the only light coming from the distant opening above, where Ethan's terrified face hovered. The water stung his eyes, filling his ears with an angry roar. He had been through rough situations before: freezing nights on the streets, fights over food and shelters, the slow, gnawing pain of hunger. But this was different. This was a fight against something bigger than himself. He kicked hard, trying to orient his body against the rushing current. Somewhere ahead, the tiny whimper of the puppy still echoed, weak and fading. Frank pushed forward his arm, straining against the pull of the water. His old muscles screamed in protest, but he ignored them. He reached out, his fingers brushing against something small and trembling. The puppy, it was barely clinging to the side of the pipe, its tiny claws scratching against the slick metal. "I got you, little guy," Frank rasped, securing his grip around the sodden fur. The puppy's body was limp from exhaustion, but its heart still pounded beneath Frank's fingers. He didn't have time to celebrate. The current surged again, dragging him further down the tunnel above ground. Ethan was gripping the edge of the grate so hard his knuckles turned white. His pulse pounded in his ears, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Frank had disappeared beneath the water, and the only proof that he was still alive was the occasional splash below. People were still walking past, ignoring him. He couldn't let this happen. "Somebody help!" Ethan shouted, his voice raw. He had never felt more powerless in his life. Then finally, someone stopped. Margaret had been locking up her cafe for the evening. When she heard the shouting, she was in her late 40s. A woman with warm, olive-toned skin and sharp, dark eyes that missed nothing. Her thick brown hair was streaked with silver, always tied back in a loose bun, and she wore an apron over her coat, a sign that she had barely finished her shift. She wasn't the kind of person who ignored things life had made her that way. She had been raised in a rough neighborhood, taught to be tough to survive, to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. Losing her husband to a car accident 10 years ago had only hardened her resolve. If she saw someone in trouble, she acted now. She was staring at the soaking, wet boy, his face streaked with rain, and panic, pointing desperately at the storm drain. "There's a man down there. He was saving a puppy, but the water, he's stuck. I think he's drowning." Ethan was practically gasping the words out. Margaret's eyes widened, and without hesitation, she pulled her phone from her coat and dialed 911. "I need emergency rescue on 4th and Monroe. Now there's a man trapped in a storm drain, and the water's rising fast." She turned back to Ethan, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "What's his name, Frank?" Ethan choked out, his body shaking. Margaret's grip tightened. "Okay."
"Frank is going to be okay. Help is coming, but we have to keep him above water. Until then, inside the drain." Frank was fighting to stay afloat. The puppy clutched tightly in his arm. His head broke the surface for a split second, just enough for him to see the light above. A voice reached him. "Margaret's calling out. Frank, if you can hear me, hold on, we're getting help." Help, the word barely registered. He didn't have time to wait. He could feel the puppy's tiny chest heaving, the little body too weak to fight anymore if he didn't act. Now it wouldn't make it, summoning the last of his strength. Frank maneuvered his body against the current, pushing himself upward. His arms were trembling, his breath ragged, but he reached toward the narrow opening above. Ethan saw the movement, and without thinking, he threw himself flat on the wet pavement, reaching down. "Frank, give me the puppy." Frank barely managed to stretch his arm upward, his hand, slipping against the cold metal of the great Ethan, lunged, his fingers closing around the scruff of the tiny, soaked creature. He pulled with everything he had, lifting the trembling puppy free of the drain. The moment the weight left his hands, Frank felt the current grab him with renewed force. Ethan's voice cracked, his arms reaching back down, but it was too late. The water surged violently, dragging Frank backward into the darkness. The last thing he saw before the world went black was Ethan's horrified face disappearing from view. Ethan's hands were shaking as he clutched the tiny drenched puppy to his chest. Rain still pounded the streets, soaking through his clothes, but he barely felt it. His eyes remained fixed on the storm drain, his voice raw from shouting, "Frank, Frank."
Beside him, Margaret gripped the edge of the pavement, scanning the swirling water below with a sickening sense of dread. Her heart pounded against her ribs, and for the first time in years, she felt helpless. She had seen hardship, had lived through loss, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of a man being swallowed by the current. Right in front of her, Ethan turned toward her, his voice cracking. "He saved the puppy. He saved him. But now his words broke off into shallow gasps. Margaret placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Listen to me, kid. He's tough. He made it this far. We're going to find him." Ethan swallowed hard and nodded, but his hands didn't stop trembling. The puppy nestled deeper into his arms, its tiny body still shivering from the cold. But its heartbeat was steady. It was safe. Frank had made sure of that. Somewhere far from them, Frank was drifting. The storm drain's current had dragged him through the underground tunnels of the city, slamming him against cold, slick walls, twisting him through the maze of water and debris. The last thing he remembered was fighting to breathe, his muscles screaming in exhaustion. Then nothing. Darkness, silence, then air. Frank coughed vehemently as his body lurched back into
consciousness. His chest burned, his limbs felt like lead, but he was alive barely. He blinked against the dim lighting, trying to make sense of his surroundings. He wasn't in the drain anymore. The smell of damp concrete and city waste was gone, replaced by the faint scent of disinfectant and old fabric. He was lying on a thin cot, a rough wool blanket thrown over him. His clothes were still damp, but he wasn't cold anymore. Where the hell am I? A door creaked open, and footsteps approached a tall man in his early 40s, entered his posture upright but not intimidating. His deep brown skin was weathered from years of labor, and his short black hair was peppered with grey. His face bore the kind of quiet strength that came from experience rather than force. And there was a kindness in his eyes that softened his otherwise serious demeanor. "Good you're awake," the man said, his voice smooth but firm. "Took you a while." Frank cleared his throat, his voice raised. "Be where the Hope Haven shelter," the man answered, pulling up a chair beside the cot. "You got lucky. Real lucky current spat you out near the river. I was doing my rounds when I saw something floating near the dock." "Turns out it was you," Frank blinked. Sluggishly, his mind still piecing together what had happened. "You pulled me out." The man nodded. "Yeah, you weren't breathing at first. Took a minute to get you back. Thought I'd lost you there." Frank let out a rough breath, still trying to steady himself. His ribs ached. His head felt like it had been smashed against a brick wall, but something else gnawed at him, something more urgent than his own. Survival. The puppy. He rasped, his throat raw, the little dog did. Did he make it? The man's brows lifted slightly in surprise, but then he exhaled, a small smile forming at the corner of his lips. "That's the first thing you're asking." Frank pushed himself up on one elbow, despite the protest from his aching body. Did he make it? The man studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Yeah, he made it a kid, and a woman got him out. The kid was screaming your name when I got there." Frank exhaled in relief, his body sinking back into the cot. He closed his eyes for a brief second, letting the tension in his chest ease. The puppy was safe. That was all that mattered. The man leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You must care about that dog an awful lot." Frank opened his eyes and met his gaze. "Wasn't about me," he said simply.
That little thing had no one. The man studied him again before nodding as if he understood something unspoken. "Name's James," he finally said, extending a hand. "I run the shelter." Frank stared at the hand for a moment before grasping it. His grip was weak, but James shook it like he was shaking a brother's. There was no pity in the gesture, just recognition. James had been running Hope Haven She Shelter for over 15 years. He had seen all kinds of people walk through his doors, veterans, single mothers, teenagers who had run away from homes that were never safe. He had seen men like Frank before, weathered, tired, carrying wounds that ran deeper than the eye could see. Some found their way back, some didn't. Frank wasn't sure which category he fell into. "Yet you should rest," James said. "Standing up, you took a beating in that storm. We'll talk more when you're stronger." Frank nodded slightly, but as James turned toward the door, a thought nagged at him. James glanced back. "The boy," Frank asked, his voice quieter now. "Ethan, he does. He have anyone?" James hesitated. "Not that I know of. He disappeared before I got to the scene. But from what I heard, kid's been on the streets for a while." Frank's jaw tightened. He had seen it before. Kids slipping through the cracks, forced to grow up too fast. He knew what happened to them if no one reached out. And Ethan was a good kid. He had stayed. He had cared. Frank wasn't sure what he could do about it, not yet. But as exhaustion finally pulled him into sleep, one thought stayed with him. If that kid was out there alone, someone had to make sure he wasn't forgotten. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the small cafe as Margaret wiped down the counter, glancing toward the cozy corner near the window. The tiny puppy, now clean and wrapped in a soft towel, lay curled in a wicker basket, its caramel-colored fur no longer matted with grime. The little thing had slept most of the night, exhausted from the ordeal. but every so often it would let out a tiny whimper, as if calling for something or someone. It had lost. Margaret sighed, tucking a stray silver streak curl behind her ear. The puppy needed a name, something strong, something that carried the weight of survival. "Lucky," she murmured, running a gentle hand over the pup's damp fur. "That's what you are lucky to be here." The door to the cafe chimed as it swung open, sending a gust of cold air through the warm interior. Ethan rushed inside, his dark brown hair still wet from the drizzle outside his oversized jacket. Barely doing its job against the Chicago wind, his wide eyes immediately landed on the small bundle in the basket. "He's okay?" Ethan asked, breathlessly. Dropping his backpack near the door and hurrying over, he knelt beside the basket, his hands hovering over Lucky, as if afraid to touch him. Margaret gave him a reassuring smile. "He's okay, kid, he just needs rest." Ethan exhaled in relief, finally reaching out to stroke the puppy's tiny head. Lucky stirred at the touch, his nose twitching as he nuzzled into the warmth of Ethan's palm. The boy chuckled softly, though his expression quickly darkened. "Frank should be here," he muttered. "He saved him. He should be here." Margaret's face softened. She had spent most of the night making calls, trying to find out what had happened after Frank was swept away. The only answer she had gotten was that emergency services had pulled a man from the river near Hope Haven Shelter. "I might have some news about him," she said carefully. "A shelter took someone in last night. I don't know for sure if it's him," but Ethan was already on his feet where Margaret barely had time to grab her coat before Ethan was pulling her toward the door. Hope Shelter wasn't far, but to Ethan the walk felt endless. His legs burned from the urgency in his steps, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had spent most of his life learning not to get attached to people, because in the end they always left. His mother had left, the foster homes had never lasted. But Frank had been different. James, the shelter manager, was just finishing a conversation with one of the volunteers when Ethan and Margaret burst through the doors. The tall, broad-shouldered man turned toward them, his sharp eyes quickly assessing the situation. "You must be looking for," Frank James said before they even spoke. Ethan's stomach twisted. "He's here." James nodded and gestured down the hall. "He's resting, but you can see him." Ethan barely waited for permission before hurrying past. He reached a small dormitory space lined with CS and stopped when he saw Frank sitting up on one of them. A wool blanket draped over his shoulders, his face was bruised, his beard damp, but he was alive. Frank, Ethan's voice cracked as he ran forward. Frank barely had time to react before Ethan threw his arms around him. The boy held on tight, his small fingers gripping Frank's coat, as if letting go would mean losing him again. Frank, caught off guard, hesitated for only a second before resting a rough, calloused hand on the boy's back. "Hey, kid," he murmured, his voice hoarse but warm. "You're squishing my ribs." Ethan pulled back, just enough to look at him, his eyes searching. I thought you were gone." Frank gave a tired smile. "Takes more than a storm drain to get rid of me." Margaret watched from the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, a small smirk playing on her lips. "Glad to see you in one piece. She said you scared the hell out of us." Frank chuckled, though it quickly turned into a cough. "Yeah, well, wasn't my best idea." Ethan sat down beside him, his knee bouncing ing with nervous energy. "Luck's okay." Margaret took him in. "We named him Lucky Frank." Face softened. "That's a good name." James, who had been leaning against the doorframe, finally stepped into the room. "You got people looking out for you." "Frank," he said, "not a lot of folks can say that." Frank looked at them. Ethan, the kid who had risked everything to save a dog. Margaret, the cafe owner who had cared enough to search for him. James, the man who had pulled him from the river without a second thought. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. James pulled up a chair and sat down. He said casually, I've seen a lot of guys come through here. Most of them, they don't talk much about their past. You don't have to either. But something tells me this isn't the first time you've run toward danger instead of away from it. Frank sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. The room was silent, expectant. After a long pause, he spoke. I used to be a firefighter. Ethan's head snapped up. What Frank leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling, as if he could see memories playing like a film reel. 15 years on the job, running into burning buildings, pulling people out. It's what I did, what I was good at. His voice tightened until I couldn't save the ones that mattered most. Margaret's breath hitched slightly. She had seen loss before. She knew that kind of pain. Frank continued, his tone quieter. Now there was a fire. My wife and daughter were inside. I was on call. But by the time I got there, he swallowed hard. I didn't get to them in time. Ethan's throat went dry. He had lost. People too, but never like that. Never. With the weight of responsibility pressing down like a crushing force. Frank exhaled sharply, shaking his head. After that, I didn't see the point in sticking around. The job, the house, everything, it didn't matter anymore. I walked away from it all, ended up on the streets, been there ever since. The room was heavy with silence. Then Ethan spoke, his voice small but firm. You saved someone again. Frank looked at him confused. Ethan straightened his shoulders. Lucky you saved him, and you saved me too. Frank held his gaze. Something inside him shifted, something he hadn't felt in years. James clapped a hand on his shoulder. Sounds to like you've got more saving left to do. Frank didn't respond right away, but for the first time in a long time, he thought that maybe, just maybe, they were right. The early morning light streamed through the cafe, windows casting a golden glow over the small space. The scent of fresh coffee and warm pastries filled the air, mingling with the quiet hum of conversation from the few customers who had braved the chilly morning. To stop by, Margaret wiped her hands on her apron, her sharp eyes scanning the shop. Frank sat at a corner table, nursing a cup of black coffee, his fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic. He looked better than he had a few days ago, less like a man weighed down by ghosts, though the weariness in his blue gay eyes still lingered. He was clean-shaven now, his salt and pepper hair combed back, and his clothes, though simple, were neat. It was a far cry from the soaked, battered figure that had been pulled from the storm drain. Margaret walked over, placing a plate of toast in front of him. You need to eat, she said. Crossing her arms, can't run on just coffee. Frank smirked, picking up a slice. Didn't know I was running. Margaret rolled her eyes. You will be, if you take my offer. Frank looked up. You serious about that? She leaned against the table. Damn right I am. Margaret wasn't the type to offer handouts. She had built this cafe from the ground up, pouring every ounce of effort into making it more than just a business. It was a place for people who needed warmth, a place where regulars felt like family. And somewhere in the last few days, Frank had become one of those people. I could use an extra pair of hands around here. She continued, someone to help with deliveries. Keep an eye on things, it's not much, but it's steady work, and you'd have a reason to be somewhere every morning. Frank hesitated, his fingers tapping against the mug. It had been years since he'd had any kind of stability. The thought of a routine of responsibility felt foreign. But when he looked at Margaret, he saw that she wasn't offering out of pity. She was offering because she believed in him. Finally, he nodded. All right, I'll take the job. Margaret smirked. Could you start tomorrow? Frank chuckled, shaking his head. Not even a training period. Sink or swim buddy, she said, patting his shoulder before heading back to the counter. Frank watched her go, a quiet sense of gratitude settling over him. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something real. Ethan sat at the kitchen table later that evening, bouncing his knee as he watched his foster mother Sarah prepare dinner. Sarah was in her early 40s, a woman with soft features and tired eyes that held a quiet strength. She had never been able to have children of her own, which was why she had opened her home to foster kids, but money was tight, and taking in another mouth to feed, especially a puppy, wasn't a simple decision. Ethan had already pleaded his case, now he was waiting for the verdict. Sarah sighed, glancing at the tiny puppy curled up in Ethan's lap. Lucky had grown stronger over the past few days, his fur fluffier, his eyes brighter. He nuzzled into Ethan's hoodie, tiny paws tucked against his chest. "You know we don't have much," Sarah said gently. "I know," Ethan said quickly. "I'll help. I'll take care of him. He won't be a burden, I promise." Sarah exhaled, leaning against the counter. She had seen the way Ethan looked at that dog, how protective he was, and she knew what it was like to want something to hold on to, something constant. After a long pause, she finally nodded. "All right, he stays." Ethan's eyes widened. "Really?" Sarah smiled softly. "Really, but you're responsible for him." Ethan beamed, hugging Lucky close. The little puppy wagged his tail, licking Ethan's chin as if he understood what had just happened. Frank, who had been sitting quietly at the table watching the exchange, felt something shift in his chest. Lucky had found a home, and for the first time in a long time, Frank felt like maybe he had too. The winter winds of Chicago gradually softened, giving way to the crisp air of early spring. The city still bustled with its usual indifference, pedestrians rushing past each other, cars honking in frustration. But inside Margaret's cafe there was warmth, not just from the scent of freshly brewed coffee or the golden light that pulled onto the wooden floors, but from the people. Frank had never imagined himself working in a cafe. Yet now he was a part of its daily rhythm. His rough hands, once accustomed to gripping fire hoses and digging through debris, now carried trays of coffee, fixed leaky pipes in the back, and sometimes, even though he'd never admit it, helped Margaret with the occasional pie recipe. He had become a presence that people noticed. The customers who had once barely glanced his way now greeted him by name. The regulars appreciated the way he checked in on them, his quiet nods of understanding, when they needed a moment of silence with their coffee. The homeless, who wandered near the cafe, found that Margaret and Frank never turned them away, always finding an extra muffin or a warm drink to offer. And then there was Lucky, the small, caramel-colored puppy, had grown into a playful, energetic dog with a tail that wagged like it was powered by pure joy. He had become the cafe's unofficial mascot, dashing between tables, greeting customers with enthusiastic licks and curling up near the counter where Margaret kept a small basket, just for him, for Ethan. Lucky had become his closest companion. Every day, after school, he would rush to the cafe, his backpack barely making it to the coat rack before Lucky tackled him with excitement. The boy, once used to loneliness, now had a friend who never failed to make him laugh one evening as the sun cast long golden shadows across the cafe. Ethan sat outside on the front steps, tossing a small rubber ball for Lucky to chase. Frank wiped his hands on a rag as he leaned against the doorframe, watching the two with a quiet sense of contentment. "Not bad for a stray," Frank remarked, nodding at Lucky, who had just skittered to a stop, his tail wagging furiously. Ethan grinned. "Not bad for either of us." Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "You're getting smart, kid. I had a good teacher." Before Frank could respond, the cafe door swung open, and a boy no older than 10 stepped hesitantly onto the sidewalk. He had light brown hair that fell into his wide blue eyes, his hands clutching the straps of his too big backpack. His clothes were clean but worn, the edges of his sleeves fraying. Ethan turned curious. "Hey, you okay?" The boy's gaze locked onto Lucky, and before anyone could say another word, he dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around the dog.
Lucky, as if sensing something unspoken, licked his face and whined, nuzzling into the boy's shoulder. Margaret, who had been clearing a nearby table, stepped outside concern, flashing in her eyes. "Sweetheart, are you lost?" The boy shook his head, burying his face into Louis's fur for a moment, before finally whispering, "I know this dog." Ethan blinked. "You know, Lucky." The boy looked up, his eyes filled with something raw and unguarded. "I used to be alone too. I used to sit by the alley near my old apartment, and sometimes this dog would come by. He would sit with me. He made me feel less invisible." Frank frowned, exchanging a glance with Margaret. The boy hesitated before adding, "I wanted to say thank you." Ethan swallowed his fingers, tightening around Lucky's collar. "He saved you, didn't he?" The boy nodded, wiping at his eyes quickly, as if embarrassed to show emotion. Margaret stepped forward, kneeling beside him. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Oliver," he mumbled. She smiled. "Well, Oliver, do you have a place to go?" Oliver hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, my foster family's just down the street. I saw him in the window and I had to come." Ethan looked down at Lucky, running a hand over his soft fur. "He does that," he murmured. Frank folded his arms, studying the boy for a moment. He recognized that look, the same one Ethan had the day they met, a mixture of uncertainty and quiet hope, the desperate need to believe that kindness was real. "You can visit him any time, kid," Frank said gruffly. "Lucky belongs to all of us now." Oliver's face broke into a small, shy smile. Thanks. As the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline, Margaret ushered Oliver inside for a cup of cocoa while he waited for his foster family. Ethan sat beside Lucky on the cafe steps, watching as the lights inside flickered on, casting a warm glow against the encroaching dusk. Frank stood nearby, hands in his pockets, taking it all in. This place, these people, they had become something he never expected: a home, a second chance, and it had all started with a tiny, crying puppy in the rain.